Look at this corkboard. Stories can be imagined like a bunch of points, all connected by string, pulling on each other, tugging, because characters and objects and places, they're all connected. They all relate to each other in some way, creating tension as events unfold and characters pull in different directions, till eventually something snaps, something breaks. And Revolution is perfect for this kind of makeup. You've got characters on opposite sides, the regime versus the resistance. But maybe you've got characters who believe in the regime and that it can be changed from within, while others demand more radical methods.
I don't think Snow used any rule book when he hijacked Peter.
You've got characters disagreeing over revolutionary methods. And then everyone agrees on bringing down the regime, but not what comes after.
A symbolic Hunger Games.
Historically, revolutions haven't always been a unified front of ideologies, but often a tangled mess of the rich wanting power, or workers wanting rights and liberation, foreign countries wanting concessions and agreements, politicians and elites wanting more control of the system, ideologues, having visions of the future that are going to be difficult, if not impossible, to implement. And maybe all the strings between these things are loose while they're fighting the regime, while they have a common goal. But once that's over, these strings are going to get tighter and tighter and tighter, till eventually you've got your characters pulling in 1,000 different directions and something comes apart. So let's talk about revolutions. By the way, guess who's sponsoring this video? Me. I am, because all of you mean that I don't need anyone else for this video. Because I took all of the discussions we've had around writing and word building and put them into these easy to read, easy to reference, expanded on writing and word building books with thousands of extra words worth of detail and analysis. Volume 1 and Volume 2 are entirely different from one another, and guess what? Volume 3 is coming later this year. That's why you guys have been voting on the covers. I love having all of you involved. If you like these kind of discussions and haven't got them yet, then I'd love for you to pick them up at the link down in the description below. But I'm also an author. I've been publishing fiction and poems with magazines for quite a while now, and I would love to share them with you if you want to read some of my work. They're linked down in the description below as well. Thank you for making it so that I can sponsor my videos with my own work. See, I've been doing all these books and stories, and revolution is a trope, right? It's not a story by itself. And when we're writing stories of revolution, we're really telling stories about struggle, sacrifice, injustice in society, how to organize ourselves, wealth and power, why people fight, the exploration of feminine agency, cycles of history, the shape of tyranny, and dangers of ideological utopian pursuit. And what the revolution is really about comes through in the story web you make. Where these threads of tension pull your characters is what your story is about. Les Miserables, which is not about the French Revolution but the 1832 June Rebellion, is my favourite musical, and it's not just about revolution, right? You've got Valjean trying to redeem himself and pursuing him with this black and white morality, asking what justice means and how the law can be unjust, all coming to a head when they confront each other and Valjean doesn't kill him, and Javert is left asking, why? What reason does he have to spare me? There's this tension between, theme, what Javert believes about the world, this black and white morality, and what Jean Valjean does in the story. And it stretches and stretches till it gets too much, and that string snaps. Then there's all these characters stuck in squalor like Fantine and Eponine, trying to get out but unable to, till that eventually kills them too. Pulling these strings in such a way to expose how classism locks people into positions in life. Then when the revolution comes along and all of them die basically and pointlessly and achieve nothing.
Empty chairs at empty tables.
And it's because the story is about the gap between ideology and reality, and how we can get caught up in it, like Javert, who was left questioning whether the criminals might actually have a point. But if they do have a point, then I'm the criminal, and in the end, the poor die because of rich people's greed. And Grantaire and Enjolras disagreeing on how to handle the revolution, that's them pulling these characters going in different directions, then dying together. This web is the revolutionary story of Les Miserables. It's what gives meaning to the story, and it's why it hits home, because it keeps stretching those things till eventually it snaps. And we spend all this time in the story weaving these strings so we know where the emphasis and point of it is. If you want your revolution, your story to explore something, it has to come out here, you know? And importantly, you actually may not realize what your story is exploring, right? Let me explain how. Like, part of the reason that some revolutionary YA dystopian novels kind of fall flat is that so many of their strings all return to basically a love triangle, right? Or some other kind of like inter-character drama that doesn't have a huge amount to do with the themes that they were supposedly discussing. These sort of triangles were often shallow, but so much time was spent on them, so many things were dependent on this point of tension connected to it via these strings, that was the point of the story. That was a New Zealand accent word. That was the point of the story. Look at what you're actually putting time into your story, what you're showing the reader, what you're foreshadowing, where the tension actually is, because that's what your story will become no matter what you tell us. A little scene at the end, over in the corner here, not really connected to the center, with only a little tiny pluck, the reverberations of which aren't felt throughout the rest of it. Well, that matters less when you spend all of your time stretching these plot points over here. It's hard to talk about War and Peace of the same breath as Divergent, but we will, and we're also going to talk about why The Hunger Games keeps getting better with time. Part 1. Injustice, alienation, and desperation. A lot of revolution-focused stories start one of two ways, and this is not to say it's realistic, but these are the story frameworks we tend to return to over and over, we find compelling. 1. The 1984 way. Someone inside the system realizes the system is broken and wants to bring it down, usually realizing a lot of what they've believed is a lie. Or 2, The Hunger Games. Someone disenfranchised by the system gets wrapped up in a revolution to bring it down. But whichever it is, I found that a lot of these stories, the best ones, really grounded themselves viscerally in those three things: injustice, alienation, and desperation. Common reasons for people to join a cause. Les Miserables shows Jean Valjean suffering at the iniquity of the justice system. Fantine's desperation to care for her child, being forced to sell herself and her hair for pennies, and there's this whole underclass of society who have been constantly alienated by the system for years. And when you feel outside the system, when you feel that your problems cannot be solved inside it, there's this realization that you are not incorporated into the system, then you have every motivation to change it. Simply telling me, "Help, help, I'm being repressed!" but not showing me how it affects people on a day-by-day level just doesn't work as well. On a line-by-line level, you've got to work at capturing emotions like desperation. So have a listen to this from Cormac McCarthy. In the morning they went on. Desolate country. A boar hide nailed to a barn door. Ratty. Wisp of a tail. Inside the barn, 3 bodies hanging from the rafters. Dried and dusty among the one slats of light. There could be something here, the boy said. There could be some corn or something. Let's go, the man said. Mostly you're worried about their shoes. That and food. Always food. In an old bad-board smokehouse, they found a ham gambrelled up in a high corner. It looked like something fetched from a tomb, so dried and drawn. He cut into it with his knife. Deep red and salty meat inside. Rich and good. They fried it that night over their fire, thick slices of it, and put the slices to simmer with a tin of beans. McCarthy's writing is incredibly evocative. He spends no time dwelling on any single instance of desperation because there is no time to feel it for these people. As soon as we read one problem, another is found, only for horrifically disturbing images to be dropped in the middle, a normal, everyday thing for them, stopping only to dwell on the food they find. This is showing us hunger and desperation from our character's perspective, where their mind is really at, where they have the bandwidth to think. There's this simplicity to his writing that doesn't even leave room for the normal horror you would feel. This sort of writing helps us understand why change needs to happen. Now, this is not a revolution story, but this sort of writing could definitely appear in it. You know, those same feelings are being channeled. It helps us understand the stakes that are at hand for the characters on a very personal, everyday level, and that is really important a lot of the time. One of the reasons a lot of YA dystopian revolution stories don't work that well is because the injustice or alienation just wasn't that convincing, or it was really contrived because we're left asking, who would even organize a society like this? What is the point of it? You're telling me that everyone has to wear a mask based on the size of their toes? Why? Whereas I know exactly what the injustice is in a world like Les Miserables, how that comes to be. It channels familiar angers and feelings. The scenes of injustice, desperation, and alienation are often the inciting incident in these sorts of stories because they give characters intense emotions that motivate them to act. Though again, this is really about revolution stories where our main character is the boss bitch who's gonna go and, fight it all out, right? The Handmaid's Tale is kind of an antidote to a lot of revolutionary writing and dystopian writing. Offred is the object of alienation, injustice, and repression, but revolution isn't really presented as an option. Because the other side of revolutionary stories, right? You've got the stories where people rise up, but the other side is stories of repression and the experiences of those under it, of the victims. Revolution happens around Offred, but she is not an agent in it. Lack of autonomy and choice is fundamental to the themes of the story, to understanding what it means to be repressed and why revolution is not an option for so many. Atwood's writing is full of genius little turns of phrase that capture Offred's desire to rebel, but inability to feel she can. Because, of course, we love to think that we would rebel, that we would fight for what's right, that we are not Offred, but a lot of us would be. And a really compelling way to explore the desperation and alienation and effects of your regime is to show why people don't rebel. Put this in your story web, and then you've got Offred's story narrowing in on her conflicts with a Serena Joy, talking about how women are pitted against each other in patriarchal systems. Put all these together and you've got a really tight bit of tension for why revolutions might be something that other people do, that you just don't have the bandwidth for. It exposes the optimistic hope that everyone can stand up for what they believe in when they can't. Part 2. Revolution as character arcs. Character arcs are the lenses through which we understand the tropes of our story. And spoilers, by the way, for Dune and the full series, skip to this point if you don't want to see them, but it is actually a revolutionary story about the dangers of following radical, chosen one, messianic leaders. Even with the admirable goal of overthrowing the imperial, corrupt system, Paul Atreides becomes a religious zealot, consolidating power in himself and taking a marginalized group, the Fremen, and turning them into a conquering force. He got some fantastic charisma rolls and is using them for all the wrong reasons. Liberation easily becomes repression when you ruling becomes inevitably better than your enemy. And so Atreides' desire for justice and peace and forging the empire together into something better, this desperation turns into something horrible. Utopian visions can galvanize a movement, but they can also justify atrocities. Paul's negative character arc, his slow descent into tyranny, shapes the meaning of the revolution and the impact the story leaves on us. It's a filter for us to understand and think about revolution as a theme and as a real force in the world. Consider how your characters change across the story and how their change colors the meaning of revolution thematically. Positive arcs where characters grow into their heroism and learn the importance of individual action and societal change matter, but War and Peace sees Natasha Rostova start out with a romanticized view of the French Revolution till eventually she becomes more and more disillusioned and loses her innocence and understands the brutality of a revolution, of the violence it entails. That ideas and heroism and belief aren't enough, and they're also not what is put through the fires of war. But, I hear you say, but, my lord, I object. Not all revolutionary stories say that, and I would say correct. young man. See, you've got to think about what conflict the characters actually face and what that says about the revolution. Just like how the characters' change will color the meaning of revolution, right? This is the framing of the revolution. V for Vendetta is pretty optimistic. It's about a marginalized people rising up for liberty, equality, and fraternity. The main obstacle Evie encounters in the story is when V basically kidnaps, imprisons, and tortures her to harden her into a revolutionary who never gives up. I know that sounds bad. It is bad. You could call him an anti-hero. It takes up a significant part of the plot. But while she's imprisoned, she is given these letters about the life of two women in love before the autocracy kicked in. There's this juxtaposition of the dark reality she now faces and the colourful life this other girl lived, and it gives Evie something to cling to so that she never gives in. But the reason the story doesn't focus on how a revolution could be corrupted or the true violence required and how dark and brutal it really is because the story is so much more about the importance of individual action, of sacrifice and individual resistance, and the virtue that is found in that. It's about empathy for others. There's an optimistic view of the world and human action in that. The revolution isn't one with a bloody war and ugly consequences. It's one with individual action, the choices of one person at a time, human empathy. Those are the forces that overcome injustice and alienation and desperation. That's the thematic messaging of the film. In The Hunger Games, Katniss and Peter have to contend with the power of a media narrative and propaganda, how it frames the narrative of injustice in the world, and in turn, how it can be used to spark revolution. One of the things that I actually keep coming back to that I really appreciate in the series is how it frames the illegitimate anger of the oppressed.
That is mahogany.
That oppressed peoples are not allowed to exhibit anger and rage and desperation because it's not polite. It's not good society manners, you know? And the rich and the powerful use that as an excuse to dismiss your concerns. Well, if you're not going to be reasonable to talk about it, well, I'm not going to listen, am I? This is sometimes called respectability politics. So Peter, understanding this, figuring this out, he rolled high on deception and pulls out an ace card.
If it weren't for the baby.
This is something that does play by those rules, but because of how Collins chose to present revolution, because of the obstacles to it that she gave Katniss and Peter, we see how the poor and marginalized are forced to refine themselves for the rich and powerful. Revolution is about controlling a message, you know? The regime wants to convince people that these are just thugs destroying the streets and all that, right? But the revolution wants people to believe that they are just fighters fighting for liberation. And then there's character conflict on top of this. Stories thrive on failure. We all know this. They're what make the eventual successes meaningful, right? Katniss failing to save her sister Prim in the end in the final book after volunteering to protect her in the first is a great subversion. I really like that because it brings her into conflict with Gale, someone who played a role in the bombs that did kill her in the end. There's this horrific redundancy to the revolution that says a lot. Manifesting realities about your revolution in character conflicts with real consequences brings it down to earth. And you might be saying, yes, the love triangle at the heart of the Hunger Games between Gale and Peter and Katniss, but not really. Like, that's there technically, but it's really quite secondary. And the conflict between the characters isn't so much about, like, them falling out of love or anything like that. It's about disagreements over methods of revolution and the conflicts that come out of that and the redundancy of her decision in the first book. So Gale's character arc of joining the revolution ties into Katniss's decision at the beginning, which ties into the themes of the story and how President Snow is not wasteful in his character development. It's all very connected in an interesting way. So yeah, maybe two characters disagree on methods and that drives a wedge between them, or it even leads to betrayal. Maybe they disagree on what society should look like after the revolution, or their experiences in the war drive them apart, with one becoming cynical and the other remaining an optimist, or being inflicted with PTSD. Revolution gives the opportunity for a ton of fascinating character dynamics. The leader faced with moral dilemmas, the follower getting disillusioned, the noble confronting their role in the horrors of before, the optimist made cynical, the afraid turned hero. So, to bring it back to our story web, it's not just about where these strings go and kind of how different things connect, but how they change over time, how different points of tension become related to certain characters or scenes or plot points. As characters change, and it changes the nature of all that pulling, because part of a story, part of what makes it interesting is that the stuff that drives the story at the beginning, the tensions that are there at the start, are not necessarily the ones at the end. A character might start out loyal to their homeland, but slowly become disgusted by it. Those strings changing, right? Or the strings might stay the same throughout the book, but grow more complex, deeper, and full of knots. They're loyal to their country, but they have to question who and what they're loyal to exactly. Is it the ideals, the government, or the people? 1. Figure out the strings of tension, where they go and start, and 2. Figure out how they change, how they grow more tense, and where they get redirected. Then look at the meaning your readers will derive from this. If you want your story to say something, it'll come from the scenes that have the most time, from the character conflict that you spend time on. Part 3. Do revolutions need to be realistic? Writing revolutions is hard, right? Because it is easy to dramatize injustice and personal vendettas. Think the innocent girl shot by the police state, a black and white narrative, but less so collective action and logistics and international support, even though I find all of those fascinating, all of which are fundamental to realistic revolutions. Go check out my video on world building them and the dictator's dilemma. That is a lot of information you'll find relevant. Collectively, studies kind of point out these 5 things are critical to realistic revolutions, and though injustice is one of them, injustice tends to actually be a moral framework that gets attached to pre-existing community instability, economic, social, political, with instability and opportunity being a far bigger motivator. And often not for great reasons, you know? See Wagner's weird-ass coup that happened in Russia recently? And then there's the question of what the hell is injustice? People are going to disagree, and you've seen how easy it is to convince large groups of people that someone deserved to be shot by the police, because that is something that people believe for some reason. Studies have shown villages in Vietnam were more likely to support one side or the other during the Civil War, depending on whoever happened to be bombing them, which, you know, fair. We get caught up in ideological motivations when we're writing stories like this, but most people just want to grill. Revolutions are a storm of complex factors that all come crashing together at once, where pre-existing instability means choosing now between 2 different types of instability, the status quo or the revolution. But, okay, this is a big point for me, and it's the point that you see in so many stories. Revolutions don't have to be realistic. You don't need to get fixated on that. They can be mythic and inspiring and optimistic, and they can use the aesthetic of revolution or dystopia to talk about other things. 1984 is a ridiculous world. It is absurd. It is baffling. It doesn't make any sense. It never made any sense. That was the point of it, right? But that is intentional. Stories like Arcane or Snow Crash or Star Wars are meant to be mythic and hopeful and legendary, even if they explore real-world things like sacrifice and found family and loyalty. Well, Snow Crash is meant to be a horrifying and bizarre projection of human weirdness. These are still stories about people in revolt. They can still be compelling, and that's just fine. It's awesome. I love these stories. Well, Arcane and Snow Crash, less Star Wars. But this does often manifest in the head of the snake fallacy ending, where killing the person at the top, like Emperor Palpatine, brings down the whole system, when in reality, I mean, it would just splinter into a mess of competing factions, probably equally as bad. It's one of those stories that even in those mythic revolutions, right, people are getting a bit tired of it. And it kind of looks like, you know, you didn't put in that much effort. Not to mention, it's often connected to the if I kill you, I'll be just the same as you, which is, I mean, obviously, for the most part, just a terrible false equivalency. Still, in these stories, the biggest conflicts are about winning battles and resisting the urge to the dark side and giving inspirational speeches and inspiring others and actually accessing and controlling your full powers. Those will turn the tides of the war. But people love this stuff, right? Doctor Who has been doing optimistic science fiction like this for decades, when someone doing the right thing in the face of tyranny can turn the tides of war. In these sorts of stories, there is a power in that. Stories do not need to be realistic to hold meaning, and they certainly don't need to be realistic to be compelling. Part 4. Chaos and revolution. Now, of course, revolutions, they're all about breaking chains of oppression and establishing a new, free, liberal order, right? Well, in theory, yes. In practice, see, we have a romanticized view of revolution, especially those of us who grew up in the YA dystopian teen love triangle everyone is divided into arbitrary categories era of fiction. A hero is plucked from the masses to overthrow the oppressive regime in the name of equality, liberty, and fraternity, with nothing than a schlocky determination and probably a dead sister or something. The reality is, though, a lot of revolutions tend to be a lucky collision of a lot of different groups at the same time whose interests are compatible in bringing down the existing regime, but not necessarily in what comes after, especially given revolutions attract, well, more radical politics. But that is why a lot of stories focus on what comes after the revolution. George R. R. Martin famously said A Song of Ice and Fire after Robert's Rebellion. That was the righteous rebellion against the evil king who was murdering people, and there was this final mythic showdown between our hero and antagonist on the Trident. It was cinematic, Rodbert and Rhaegar. But that's because George R. R. Martin was more interested in what came after. How do you reorganize society? How do you keep it from falling back into chaos? Revolutions naturally attract radical religious, economic, ethnic ideologies, and when the common enemy is gone, those clash. I've already mentioned Dune, but Ursula Le Guin's The Dispossessed is a fantastic look at a post-revolution world. And ours is this anarchist society founded on, supposedly, equality, communal living, cooperation, but it struggles with sustainability, with forging a cohesive identity for itself, with isolation and trying to realize these ideas. And our characters are forced to choose as they experience more of the flaws of these utopian ideas, looking at that gap that can develop between the aims of the revolution and how to get there. Here's the thing. Revolution isn't just something that happens once and then it's done. It has to keep happening, to adapt and be flexible, and utopian ideas often aren't. Revolution is a constant process full of growing pains, not a single moment, and you can use that to create tension between your characters. Famously, Katniss chooses to kill President Coin instead of President Snow because she fears Coin will become a dictator, starting another Hunger Games, and you know what? She was right. Autocracy is less complex a system than democracy, so it's easier for autocracies to rise out of instability than democracies. Pierce Brown's Red Rising does similar in exploring how revolutions can be poisoned by competing interests in the various factions of a post-revolution world. The House of Augustus and the Sons of Ares all have ulterior motives, leading to devastating consequences. Darrow, our main character, has to contend with them all. What does it mean to remain moral in a post-revolution world? How do you keep people fed and working and deal with chaos when you're finally in charge? Who do you blame and how do you manage it when the war tore the country apart and destroyed so much of its infrastructure that you no longer have what you need to build the society you promised? What do you do about the groups who joined the revolution, but for different promises, for trade deals? You took support from, foreign interests. And how do you protect the rights of people who might have been previously oppressive? And how do you deal with them? There are costs to war, physical, psychological, and sometimes no victory heals all wounds. One last really interesting point is that people will idealize the past, even oppressive regimes, because the reality is that every regime is good for someone and often more people than you think. A 2019 poll found 59% of Russians felt the Soviet Union took care of ordinary people. 66% even regretted its dissolution, an undemocratic regime that repressed over a dozen surrounding countries. In 2011, 56% of Lithuanians felt their standard of living had fallen since the Soviet dissolution, and even though a majority in almost every country except Russia believed the Soviet Union did more harm than good, elderly people really did depend on the Soviet Union's very generous pension plan. They worked to it their entire lives, and suddenly gone. They grew up in that culture and it was taken from them. Separating one's identity from a critique of how that society might have run can be really, really difficult for a lot of people. This, again, can create conflict between your characters in that post-revolution world, where people feel some loyalty to how things might have been, even if they kind of do understand the problems with it. That's a really fascinating place to take your characters psychologically. How do they reconcile their connection to a place, to a job, to a regime with what they find out it did? Or the things that maybe it did, but there's not enough evidence. Or alternatively, it might genuinely be morally ambiguous as to whether the regime was bad at all. What do they justify to themselves and what do they let go of? All these questions and tensions can create a really interesting story web, right, in your revolutionary world. And the best ones always know which ones to tangle and which ones to snap. Let's bring all this together in a summary, but first, go get my book. I mean, if you made it this far into the video, then this is the book for you. If you only want to get one of them, that's okay, but I say get volume 2. I think it has a better selection of topics, but I will say volume 3 coming later this year is going to be the best of them all. I'm really happy with how it's turning out. And I'll put it out to a vote, but we'll be picking between these two kind of cover concepts before I send it off to the artist to develop it more. As said, these have all of the writing and word building discussions I've had and more in more detail, expanded analysis, and I am astounded with how well it has sold, like genuinely like 80,000 copies or something. I expected 500 when I first published these. Thank you so much from the bottom of my heart. And if you want to check out my writing, I recommend reading Two Robots at the End of the World. That was published with Utopia Science Fiction magazine. I actually have my first poetry publication coming this month. I've never really tried it that much, but I wanted to give it a hand, and yay! Thank you so much if you do. There are links down below. Keeps the channel alive, keeps me having some faith in myself. Thank you so much. On to the summary. Firstly, revolutions are only as compelling as the reasons to lead them. Show the reader the injustice, alienation, and desperation on a personal level. Second, the substance of your character arcs and conflicts will colour the meaning and themes of the revolution itself. Thirdly, realistic revolutions are drawn from a complex mix of proximate socioeconomic instability, alienation, collapse of the social order, elite infighting, injustice, and international support. Some are harder to dramatize, but can make your story more grounded. Fourthly, stories don't need to be realistic to be meaningful or compelling. Revolutions are often mythic. However, this can also lead to the head of the snake problem. Fifthly, it can be equally important to show the reasons why people don't revolt. And sixthly, many stories focus on what happens after the revolution, infighting, the struggle to realize a utopian dream, and the gap between ideals and execution. All of this can create a fascinating story web. So, if you were to create your story and lay it out kind of like this, what is in the center? What points of tension? Which characters? What characters are doing, right? What's in the middle? What connects? What's out on the edges? And which of these strings do you tug on most? Stay nerdy, and I'll see you in the future. Who is this man? What sort of devil is he? To have me caught in a trap and choose to let me go free? It was his hour at last to put a seal on my fate. Wipe out the past and watch me clean up the slate. All it would take was a flick of his knife. Vengeance was his and he gave me back my life. Damned if I'll live in the dead of a thief. Damned if I'll yield at the end of the chase. I am the law and the law is not mocked. I'll spit his pity right back in his face. There is nothing on earth that we share. It is either Valjean or Javert. How can I not allow the man? How can I not allow this man to hold dominion over me? This desperate man that I have hunted. Oh my gosh.